Hey church, and welcome to this week's small group. Now this last Sunday we asked the question, am I thankful for the right reasons? And the answer that we came up with is humility leads to true thankfulness. We can't be truly thankful until we're humble. You remember when you were a kid and you took everything for granted? Do you remember being young enough to where you didn't know the difference between $1,000, $10,000 and $100,000? I remember when I was a kid, I used to watch America's Funniest Home Videos. And at the end of every episode, they would give away $10,000 to somebody in the audience. And I remember thinking as a kid, man, if we could just win that, we would be like millionaires. Because I had no idea how much things actually cost. I didn't understand numbers. You know, I don't think that I could ever be completely thankful to my parents for all that they had given me until I understood how much things actually cost. And in the same way, you know, sometimes I think we prefer to focus exclusively on God's grace. But the problem is when we do that, then we don't understand why grace is so special, because we don't understand what God saved us from. We don't understand the cost, and that's God's judgment. And so why do you think so many people see Jesus as just a good, nice teacher and fail to consider his teachings about judgment? You know, I think talking about judgment makes us uncomfortable. That's why we prefer Jesus to be just a nice teacher. But sometimes we need to talk about judgment so that we can be truly thankful for God's grace. Let's read through a story that Jesus told on judgment. Read Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 35. Why were the servants so violent in this story? And based on these scriptures alone, who does the master represent? Who are the tenants? And what does the field represent? If those last questions were hard to figure out, it's okay. That was the point of asking them. You know, this is how most of us read Scripture. When we read it ourselves, we get frustrated and eventually we give up. But now I want you to experience the power of context. You see, Jesus was speaking to a bunch of people who took the Old Testament very seriously. In fact, some religious leaders even memorized the entire Old Testament. And so Jesus was making a reference to the Old Testament. Let's read this Old Testament passage so that we can understand Jesus' words the way that those people that day understood them. So read Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. This is what Jesus was referencing. So in the light of the Old Testament passages, who do you believe now is the master? Who are the tenants? And who does the field represent? And how does knowing the context shed light on Jesus' parable for you? So in the story, obviously the master represents God. The field represents God's chosen people, who are Israel. And the tenants are the religious leaders. Notice that in the Old Testament passage, God is saying that Israel is a field that isn't producing fruit. And that's a problem for God. So what are the responsibilities that come with our privilege of being God's chosen people today? And what kind of fruit are we supposed to bear as Christians? In the next few passages, Jesus issues a warning to the Pharisees and the religious leaders. Read Matthew chapter 21, verses 36 through 41. When you hear the word warning, what images and feelings come to mind? Is Jesus being mean to the Pharisees, or is he showing them grace? And why? And how are God's warnings to us a sign of his grace? Hopefully God is changing your perspective on warnings. Instead of seeing them as something bad, actually seeing them as something that God does out of love for us. You see, a lot of people tend to focus on the judgment in this story, and they're shocked by God's judgment. But you know what's even more shocking than that? Is God's patience. I mean, I want you to think about this. In the story, if it were me, the very first messenger that was abused by the tenants would have resulted in a huge punishment. But you notice how God allows these religious leaders to abuse and kill prophet after prophet after prophet. And it's not until his own son is crucified before he enacts his judgment. What's shocking is the patience of God. Next, I want you to read Matthew chapter 21, verses 42 through 46. What are some ways we might use religiosity to mask our lack of fruitfulness? And what aspects of this parable's warning apply to us today? Notice how this parable was spoken at a different time to a different audience, but it still applies to us today. I want you to see that God desires for his people to produce fruit. So, final question for this small group. What role does bearing fruit play in our mission to share and show the love of God to other people? When you're done answering that question, close in prayer. Thank Jesus for what he did for us. Then ask God to produce humility and fruitfulness in our own lives. And remember, humility leads to true thankfulness. God bless you. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you on Sunday.